The dust on Xylos didn't fall anymore. It chimed, each mote a microscopic crystal catching the dying light of its distant sun and scattering it into 1,000 fractured rainbows against the viewport of the Grand Archive's deepest observation deck. Dr. Eris Thorne had stopped looking days ago, perhaps weeks, as the very concept of time had begun to erode along with the world outside. But she could still hear it, a constant, faint, melodic hiss that was slowly replacing the memory of wind. This was how a world died, not with a bang or a whimper, but with a terrible, beautiful song played on the bones of a planet being turned to glass. The silicates had come without warning, a silent tide of crystalline intelligence that did not conquer but converted, their inexorable advance turning soil to quartz, oceans to solid amethyst, and living things into screaming, silent statues of multifaceted agony. Her colleagues were still up there on the surface levels, frozen in the last moments of their terror, their bodies now elegant, shimmering sculptures that mocked the messy, organic lives they had once held so dear. A permanent exhibition of the day the Galactic Concordiat's promises had been proven as brittle as the world was becoming. Eris had sent the messages, the frantic, desperate pleas for aid, her voice joining a chorus of ghosts from a dozen other worlds consumed in the same silent, glittering fire, screaming into the void on every official Concordiat frequency until her throat was raw and the comms unit had overheated into a useless lump of melted plastic. No one answered. The Protectorate fleet assigned to the Outer Arm had been rerouted to quell a trade dispute in the core systems. The Concordiat Senate was mired in a debate over sanctions against a species that had no economy to sanction, and the rest of the galaxy, it seemed, was content to watch another light go out as long as it wasn't their own. Xylos was an archive world, a place of memory, and its death was a quiet affair, unworthy of a fleet, unworthy of a response. Just another footnote in the long, slow decay of a civilization that had forgotten how to care, alone in the subterranean dark, surrounded by the data ghosts of 1,000 extinct species. Eris Thorne, the last living archivist on Xylos, decided she would not let this end be a footnote. She would not let the silicates turn the memory of her world, of her friends, into just another pretty to silent thing. The archive held secrets older than the Concordiat itself, technologies deemed too unstable, too unpredictable, too primitive for the delicate sensibilities of modern galactic society, and in the lowest levels, in a vault sealed with alloys no scanner could penetrate, she found it. A transmitter from a species that had vanished long before the first aliens had ever reached for the stars. A species the archives called humanity. The device was a monstrosity of raw power and brute force. A machine that didn't request a channel, but tore one open through the fabric of space-time, screaming a signal across every possible spectrum, a shriek of pure data that ignored protocol and politeness. It was powered by a contained singularity, a tamed black hole the size of her fist that hummed with a rage that vibrated deep in her bones, and she poured everything into it, the silicate's crystalline resonant frequency, their method of conversion, every last bite of data she had gathered, and with it, her own despair, her own scream for someone, anyone, to bear witness to the end of everything she had ever known. Then she had switched it off, the sudden silence in the vault more deafening than the roar of a dying star, and she had waited for an answer that she knew, with the cold certainty of a scholar who had studied the fall of empires, would never come. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a slow descent into a madness born of absolute silence and crushing pressure. the archive groaning around her as the crystalline lattice of the silicates worked its way deeper into the planet's crust. She spent her cycles methodically moving through the data stacks, ensuring the core memory banks were sealed, that the stasis fields protecting the most fragile artifacts were stable, a final act of defiant curation against the encroaching, silent apocalypse. Her world had shrunk to the recycled air of the lower levels, the hum of the life support systems, and the endless rows of silent data cores that held the last vestiges of civilizations that had suffered fates not so different from her own. She began to talk to them, whispering the stories of her own people, the Cathar, a species of scholars and poets, to the silent, sleeping memories of warriors and dreamers from long-dead stars, a final exchange of culture at the edge of oblivion. She ate the tasteless nutrient paste from the emergency supplies, drank the recycled water that tasted faintly of ozone and despair, and watched the seismic sensors track the silicate conversion front, a slow-moving wall of transformation that was now less than a kilometer from the archive's outer foundation. The faint, chiming hiss of the crystal dust had become a low, resonant hum that she could feel in her teeth, the song of her world's final, agonizing moments of transformation, and a strange sense of peace began to settle over her. She was the last librarian, and she would go down with her library, her body becoming another silent testament to a story that would never be told. But the story itself, the knowledge she protected, would be safe, encased in layers of shielded rock and forgotten technologies, a time capsule for a future that would likely never arrive. It was a fool's hope, but it was the only one she had left, and she clung to it as the vibrations grew stronger, as the lights in the archive began to flicker, their power cells struggling against the encroaching crystalline interference. She found a small alcove in the primary server room, a place where the hum of 1 billion stored memories felt like a lullaby. And she sat down, pulling a thermal blanket around her thin shoulders, ready to become another artifact in the endless collection of the past, ready for the silence to finally take her as it had taken everyone else. But the sound that came next was not the silent, creeping transformation of the silicates. It was a sound of violence, a brutal, profane shriek of tearing metal and atmospheric friction that violated the funereal calm of her dying world. It was followed by an impact, a ground-shaking concussion that was not melodic or resonant, but was instead a chaotic, ugly, and utterly furious noise. A fist slammed on a table in a silent room, a tantrum of physics that sent a shockwave through the rock and knocked half the data cores from their racks. For the first time in months, Eris felt something other than despair or resignation. She felt a jolt of raw, animal terror mixed with a bewildering spark of confusion. The silicates were silent, methodical. They did not crash. They did not burn. They simply arrived. And this, whatever this was the antithesis of their nature. It was loud, messy, and impossibly, horrifically alive. She scrambled to the observation deck, her heart hammering against her ribs, and forced the emergency blast shields to retract, the ancient metal groaning in protest. Outside, under the crystalline sky, a crater had been gouged into the amethyst plains, a fresh wound of shattered crystal and superheated rock, and in the center of it sat the most absurd vessel she had ever seen. It was less a ship and more a collection of parts that had been forced to coexist against their will, a patchwork of scarred hull plates, mismatched engine modules that sputtered angry jets of plasma, and a cockpit that looked like it had been salvaged from a freighter and welded on as an afterthought. It was a junk pile with ambitions, a flying insult to the elegant laws of astrophysics. And as she watched, a ramp slammed down with a clang that echoed across the silent landscape, a sound as alien and shocking as a gunshot in a temple. A figure emerged, walking with a swagger that seemed to completely ignore the fact that they were standing on a world in the process of being devoured by a crystalline entity, their armor as mismatched as their ship, a combination of military-grade plating on the chest, scavenged cargo hauler greaves on the legs, and a helmet that looked like it belonged to a deep space miner. Eris grabbed the only thing nearby that could serve as a weapon, a heavy-duty geological hammer used for taking core samples, its weight unfamiliar and clumsy in her hands, and made her way to the surface access tunnel, her mind racing. It couldn't be the Concordiate. Their ships were sleek, beautiful things, symbols of a power that was more concerned with appearance than function. This was something else, something old and broken and angry, something that had no right to be here. And as she unsealed the final airlock, the crystalline air hissing into the tunnel, she saw the figure approaching, their boots crunching on the amethyst ground with a careless rhythm. The figure stopped a dozen paces from the archive entrance, and the helmet retracted with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a face that she had only ever seen in two-dimensional historical files, a face that was both shockingly familiar and utterly alien. It was a human, his face a roadmap of scars and cynicism, a scruffy beard clinging to his jaw, and eyes that seemed to be constantly calculating the salvage value of everything they saw. He looked from the shimmering, frozen statues of her colleagues to the gaping maw of the archive entrance, and then his eyes landed on her, a small, terrified scholar holding a rock hammer. A wry, humorless smirk touched his lips as he raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a lazy, dismissive wave that seemed to encompass the entire planetary tragedy around them. "Heard a scream," the human said, his voice a low gravel, distorted slightly by the thin, crystalline atmosphere. "Sounded expensive." Eris stood frozen in the archive's maw, the geological hammer feeling impossibly heavy, a useless talisman against the sheer absurdity of the moment. Her world was ending in a silent, crystalline symphony, and its sole visitor was a junker who had mistaken a planet's death rattle for the sound of profit. "Who are you?" she finally managed, her voice thin and reedy in the strange air, barely a whisper against the constant, low hum of the planet's transformation. The human's smirk widened, a cynical slash in his weathered face, and he gestured vaguely at the wreck of his ship, half buried in the crater it had carved. "Name's Jax, and you're looking at the captain, crew, and chief acquisitions officer of the Stray Dog. As for who I am, I'm the guy who answers weird calls." He took a few steps closer, his gaze sweeping over the crystalline landscape, not with horror or pity, but with a detached, professional curiosity, like a predator assessing a new hunting ground. "You're not with the Concordiate," Ares stated, the words an accusation, a confirmation of her deepest fears that the cavalry was not, and had never been, coming. Jax let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh, a sound like grinding gravel that seemed to grate on the delicate crystalline air. "The Concordiate lady. The only time I deal with those starched shirt bureaucrats is when I'm selling them back the tech they lost in their last pointless border skirmish. They don't have the gear to hear the kind of noise you were making. They filter out the old frequencies, call it legacy interference. They're deaf, dumb, and blind to anything that existed before their precious little treaty was signed." His eyes narrowed, focusing on her, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the callous opportunism, a flicker of genuine, sharp intelligence. "That signal you sent, it wasn't modern. It was loud. It was raw. And it punched a hole through subspace that most ships would write off as a solar flare. But my ship, she's old. She likes the old songs. She heard you loud and clear." Eris felt a cold dread wash over her that had nothing to do with the silicates. "You were tracking the signal," she whispered, the realization dawning. "You weren't coming to help." Jax shrugged, a gesture that was infuriatingly casual amidst the planetary apocalypse. "Help is a strong word. Let's say my professional interest was piqued. A signal that powerful usually comes from a pre-collapse power source. An artifact. Artifacts are worth a lot of money to the right people. People like the Concordiate, ironically enough. So, in a way, I was coming to help myself." He gestured with his chin toward the archive entrance. "And it looks like I found the source. Big place you got here. What is it? Some kind of tomb?" The callousness of the question was like a physical blow, and a wave of pure, undiluted rage washed through Eris, burning away her fear. For months, she had been a victim, a helpless observer to the end of her world. But this man, this grave-robbing human, had just desecrated the memory of everything she had sworn to protect. "This is not a tomb," she snapped, her voice cracking with fury as she took a step forward, hefting the hammer. "This is the Grand Archive of Xylos. It holds the memories of 1,000 worlds, the last words of species you couldn't possibly comprehend. Those things," she gestured to the shimmering statues of her friends, "were my colleagues, my family, and you come here looking to scavenge our bones." For a moment, Jax's cynical mask slipped. His eyes followed her gesture, and he looked, truly looked, at the crystalline figures, at the way the light refracted through their forms, capturing their final expressions of agony and terror in eternal, beautiful detail. His smirk faded, replaced by a grim, hard line. "Glass ghosts," he muttered, the words low and tasting of old, bad memories. "Haven't seen one of these in a long time. Not a whole world of them." He looked back at Ares, his expression unreadable, the opportunist replaced by something harder, something colder. "So that's what's doing this." The signal wasn't just a beacon. It was a warning. "You weren't just screaming. You were sending data." Eris lowered the hammer slightly, taken aback by the sudden shift in his demeanor. "You've seen this before, on a moon, out in the Tartarus Rift," Jax said, his gaze distant. "A small mining colony. Went silent. The Concordiate wrote it off as a rig failure. I went looking for salvage. Found them all like this. A garden of pretty statues. Didn't know what did it, but I knew it wasn't natural." He looked around again, his eyes assessing the situation with a new, tactical awareness. "This is bad. This is world-ending bad, and the Concordiate is probably still debating the proper filing procedure for a planetary distress call." He then pinned her with a look that was all business. "The transmitter you used, the one that sent the expensive signal, it's old, human tech. Isn't it pre-collapse? One of the old god screamers." Eris stared at him, stunned into silence. The archives had called it a subspace resonance emitter, but the colloquial name he used felt far more appropriate, a name given by people who had built it and understood its terrible power. "How did you know?" she breathed. "Because," Jax said, tapping the side of his battered helmet, "only our junk is loud enough to wake up the dead, and only our junk is old enough that the rest of the galaxy has forgotten how to listen to it." He took another step closer, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. "Look, Lady Archivist, Your world is already dead. The Concordiate isn't coming. And even if they did, they just cordon off the system and study it for the next 50 years. You can stay here and become a very knowledgeable statue, or you can make a deal with the only person in the universe who was smart enough or stupid enough to answer your call. He held out a hand, his glove worn and stained with grease. I have a ship that can get us out of here. It's ugly, but it's fast, and it knows how to hide. You show me where that God Screamer is. You give it to me as payment for the rescue and the fuel I burned getting here, and I'll drop you off at the nearest civilized port with a pulse. You get to live. You get to tell your story. And I get a piece of tech that will set me up for life. The proposition was so cold, so transactional, it left her breathless. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't a savior. He was a mercenary offering her an escape pod in exchange for the most powerful artifact in the archive, the very thing that had brought him here. To hand it over felt like a betrayal of everything the archive stood for, a violation of her sacred duty. But as the ground beneath her feet vibrated with the relentless advance of the silicates, as the chiming song of her dying world grew ever louder, she looked at the human's outstretched hand, and then at the endless, silent darkness of the archive behind her. It was a choice between dying with her principles in a silent tomb or living with the bitter taste of compromise. A choice between honoring the dead and saving the last living person who remembered them. The hope he offered was a dirty, selfish, ugly thing, but it was hope nonetheless. And in a dying world, even the most tarnished hope was a treasure beyond measure. She looked Jax in the eye, the last archivist of Xylos and the first human she had ever met, and made the only choice a survivor could. The geological hammer fell from her grasp, its clatter on the crystalline ground a sharp, profane sound in the quiet of the dying world, a sound of surrender. I accept, Eris said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, a eulogy for her own principles. Jax didn't smile in triumph. His face remained a mask of grim practicality, his gaze already scanning the darkening, rainbow-hued sky. Good, he grunted, his voice all business. The clock's ticking. Your planet's humming is getting a few octaves higher, and I'm not a fan of the chorus. Lead the way to the noisemaker, archivist, and make it fast. The stray dog gets nervous when it sits in one place for too long, especially when the ground it's sitting on is actively trying to turn into a giant paperweight. With a final, sorrowful glance at the frozen figures of her colleagues, now little more than beautiful, silent scenery in the grand tragedy of Xylos, Eris turned and led the human into the depths of the grand archive. The heavy blast door hissed shut behind them, sealing them in the recycled air and the profound, heavy silence of stored history, a silence that was now punctuated by the crunch of Jax's heavy boots on the polished stone floors. The descent was a journey through a graveyard of galactic empires. They passed through halls lined with stasis pods containing the last flora of a world consumed by a rogue nebula, its ghostly, bioluminescent flowers pulsing with a soft, sad light. They walked by galleries where holographic emitters played out the final moments of the insectoid lyric singers of Antares 7, their beautiful, complex songs cut short by a solar flare that had boiled their oceans. To Eris, every step was a painful pilgrimage, a reminder of the duty she was about to betray. This is the chamber of lost tongues, she explained, her voice hushed with reverence as they passed a shimmering field of data light where 1,000,000 extinct languages flowed like a river of soundless words. It holds every dialect, every poem, every forgotten curse from over 12,000 sentient species. Jax barely gave it a glance, his attention fixed on the structural supports of the ceiling, his hand resting on the battered pistol holstered at his hip. "Any of them say how to kill a planet made of rock candy?" he asked, his gaze flicking to a hairline fracture in the wall from which a thin, glittering fluid was slowly seeping, crystallizing as it met the air. "Because that would be useful right now. The rest is just static." His dismissiveness was a constant, grating insult, yet Eris found herself grudgingly impressed by his focus. He saw not a sanctuary of knowledge, but a collapsing structure, a death trap. He assessed every corridor for ambush points, every flickering light as a potential power failure, every groan of the deep foundations as a threat. He was a creature of the immediate, violent present, a perfect antibody to her world of the preserved, sterile past. As they moved deeper into the older, more restricted levels of the archive, the artifacts began to change. The polished displays and elegant stasis fields gave way to heavily shielded containment vaults and raw, functional plinths. This was the technology the Concordiate had deemed too dangerous to remember. The weapons and power sources of civilizations that had burned too brightly and died too quickly. Eris had studied them as abstract concepts, as historical footnotes on the dangers of unchecked ambition. Jax, however, looked at them with a disturbing familiarity. He stopped before a dull, gray rifle mounted on a wall, its design brutally simplistic, a long barrel and a heavy stock with no apparent energy cell. "Kinetic accelerator. Mark 7, he murmured, a flicker of something that might have been nostalgia in his eyes. "Pre-collapse. Fired a solid slug of depleted uranium at a measurable fraction of light speed. They called it the Fist of God. My great-grandfather used to pilot a hauler in the Outer Rim. Said he saw one of these punch a clean hole through a pirate cruiser, bow to stern. The Concordiate banned them, of course. Too effective. Not enough collateral damage for their liking." Eris stared at him, a new unease creeping in. "You know our history. The collapse of humanity. It's a restricted file. Even here." Jax ran a gloved finger along the barrel of the ancient weapon. "You have the official report, the sanitized version. Political infighting, societal decay, self-imposed isolation. We have the memories. We remember what it was like when our own creations turned on us, when our star-spanning empire tore itself apart from the inside out. We learned a valuable lesson your Concordiate has forgotten when the universe comes knocking. You don't answer with a treaty and a trade agreement. You answer with a bigger gun." He pushed off the wall and continued walking, leaving Eris to grapple with the chilling implication that the primitive, unpredictable humans the galaxy had dismissed as a failed experiment had a history far bloodier and more pragmatic than any of her data scrolls had ever suggested. The vibrations from the surface were growing stronger now, a constant, bone-deep thrum that made the floor plates beneath their feet tremble. The lights flickered more frequently, and the air had grown colder, carrying with it the faint, sweet scent of ozone and newly formed crystal. The silicate conversion was accelerating. Eris felt a fresh wave of panic. They were running out of time. Finally, they reached the lowest level, the foundation of the archive, a vast, cavernous chamber carved from the planet's bedrock. In the center stood a single, massive vault door, a perfect circle of seamless, black metal that seemed to absorb the light around it. There were no keypads, no levers, no visible mechanisms of any kind. "This is it," Eris said, her voice barely a whisper. "The 0-point vault. The technology used to build it was lost even before the archive was completed. It's powered by its own internal energy source and is shielded against every form of scanning and external force we've ever conceived of. Jax walked a slow circle around the vault, tapping the surface with his knuckles. The sound was a dull, flat thud, as if he were knocking on the edge of reality itself. "So, how do we open it?" he asked. Eris gestured to a small, dusty console a few meters away. "The archives say it's an energy resonance lock. The original builders, the long-vanished Signans, keyed it to their unique biosignature. We've only ever been able to open it by using the main fusion generator to perfectly replicate that frequency, a process that takes 3 days in the power output of a small star." Jax looked from the dead console to the flickering lights of the chamber. "Yeah, we don't have 3 days. And it looks like your power grid is about to take a permanent coffee break. There's got to be another way." He knelt by the console, his fingers prying open a service panel with a grunt of effort, revealing a tangled mess of crystalline wires and burned-out conduits. Eris shook her head, a sense of hopelessness washing over her. There is no other way. It was designed to be inviolable. And Jax ignored her, pulling a device from his belt that looked like a cross between a power drill and a surgical instrument. Nothing is inviolable, Archivist. It's just a matter of finding the right tool to violate it with. You say it needs a specific energy frequency. Your big shot generator was probably just a glorified tuning fork. What we need is a targeted energy spike, something to kick the lock in the teeth and force it to listen. He began to expertly splice a thick power cable from a nearby junction box into his device, his movements quick and precise. The main conduits running through this level feed the atmospheric regulators for the entire lower archive. They're still drawing a trickle of power. It's not clean, but it's raw, and it's a lot of it. He looked up at her, a manic grin on his face. "I'm going to divert the entire power feed for this sector into a single, focused burst and jam it straight into the lock's main circuit. It'll either trip the tumblers or blow half this level back to the Stone Age. 50-50. I like those odds." Eris was horrified. "You can't. You'll overload the entire system. You could destabilize the foundations." "Lady," Jax said, not looking up from his work as sparks began to fly from the console. "The foundations are currently being turned into a chandelier. A little explosion is the least of our worries." He worked for another minute, sweat beading on his forehead, his breath coming in short, focused bursts. The hum of his device grew louder, rising in pitch until it was a painful whine that made her teeth ache. The lights in the chamber dimmed, then went out completely, plunging them into a darkness that was broken only by the angry pulsing glow of Jax's tool. "Get ready," he shouted over the noise. "This is going to be loud." He slammed a heavy switch on the side of his device, and a bolt of pure, white energy, a miniature lightning strike, leaped from the tool and slammed into the center of the black vault door. The sound was not an explosion, but a deafening, soul-shaking bong, like a cosmic bell being struck once. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The energy dissipated, the whine of the tool died, and the darkness and silence returned, more absolute than before. "Well," Jax muttered, his voice echoing in the vast chamber, "that was disappointing." But then, a low groan began to emanate from the door, a sound of immense, ancient machinery stirring from a long slumber. A thin, hairline seam of blue light appeared, tracing a perfect circle on the door's surface. With a hiss of displaced air, The massive circular portal began to retract into the wall, revealing a smaller chamber beyond, bathed in the soft and crimson glow of a single, massive, and terrifyingly active piece of machinery. There, on a raised dais, sat the God Screamer. It was not a sleek, elegant device. It was a brutalist sculpture of exposed wiring, thick as a man's arm, coiling around a central sphere of what looked like solidified darkness. Heat sinks the size of tombstones glowed with a dull, internal fire, and the air around it shimmered with raw, barely contained power. It was the physical manifestation of a scream, a weapon of last resort built by a desperate, dying race. And it was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Eris had ever seen. As they stepped into the vault, a new sound began to intrude, a high-pitched, crystalline cracking that came not from the ceiling or the floor, but from the vault door itself. Eris turned just in time to see a spiderweb of iridescent fractures spread across the black metal where the energy blast had struck. The silicate conversion, accelerated by the massive energy discharge, was no longer just creeping, it was attacking. With a sound like shattering glass 1,000,000 times over, a single, needle-sharp spire of pure amethyst, impossibly long and thin, punched through the center of the vault door. It grew with terrifying speed, branching out like a frost pattern on a window pane. The melodious chiming of the dying world outside suddenly inside the room with them. A deafening, all-consuming roar. The air around the spire grew instantly, painfully cold, and the moisture began to condense and freeze on the walls, forming delicate, deadly crystal flowers. Jax didn't hesitate. He drew his pistol, the weapon looking like a child's toy against the impossible geometry of the growing silicate intrusion, and his cynical smirk was gone, replaced by the grim, feral snarl of a cornered animal. "All right, archivist," he snarled, his voice tight with a tension that bordered on rage. "We got the prize. Now we fight our way out of the damn museum." The silicate spire pulsed with an internal, violet light, its growth no longer a slow creep, but a violent, explosive flowering, crystalline tendrils, as thin and sharp as surgical needles, unfurled from the main structure, probing the air with a terrifying, sentient purpose. The temperature in the vault plummeted, Eris's breath misting and freezing in the air before her, and the deafening, chiming roar of the conversion process was now a physical pressure, a force that vibrated in her bones and made her skull feel like it was about to crack. This wasn't just a geological transformation anymore, it was an invasion. A hostile, intelligent force that had been drawn to the raw power of the vault like a shark to blood. "Move!" Jax roared, grabbing Eris by the arm and yanking her back from the rapidly encroaching crystal frost. His pistol barked twice, the sound shockingly loud in the enclosed space. 2 solid slugs slammed into the main spire, not to destroy it, but to shatter the smaller, more delicate tendrils that were reaching for the dais where the God Screamer sat. The impact sent a shower of razor-sharp amethyst shards flying through the air, and Jax shielded his face with his free arm, cursing as one of the fragments sliced a deep gash across his cheek. "It's adapting," he grunted, his voice tight with a mixture of pain and grudging respect. It felt the energy spike, and now it's treating this vault as a threat. It's not just growing, it's hunting. The silicate spire seemed to agree, as the point where his bullets had struck instantly began to regrow, this time forming a thicker, more robust crystalline lattice, a shield of its own making. It was learning. Eris's mind, the mind of a scholar trained to observe and categorize, struggled to process the sheer impossibility of what she was seeing. The silicates, as far as any Concordiate xenobiologist had been able to determine, were a non-sentient, geological phenomenon, a form of crystalline life that operated on instinct and planetary resonance. But this was different. This was tactical. "The God Screamer," she said, her voice trembling as the realization hit her. "It's not just a transmitter. It's a resonance weapon. The silicates aren't just drawn to its power. They're communicating with it, or trying to." Jax fired again, this time aiming at the thick coils of power conduits that snaked across the floor, feeding the God Screamer. One of the conduits exploded in a shower of blue sparks, and the crimson glow of the device on the dais flickered for a moment, its hum dropping in pitch. The effect on the silicate spire was instantaneous. Its growth faltered, the internal violet light dimmed, and the deafening chime lessened to a manageable, if still painful, hum. "If we can't move it, we starve it," Jack snarled, reloading his pistol with a practiced, efficient click. "Help me disconnect this damn thing before our exit gets permanently sealed." The task was a desperate, frantic race against a foe that did not tire and could not be reasoned with, while Jax used his pistol to strategically sever the smaller power lines. Eris, her initial terror now sublimated into a cold and focused urgency, worked on the main couplings at the base of the dais. The technology was ancient, human, and brutally, beautifully simple. There were no delicate touch panels or genetic locks, only massive, lever-activated clamps and thick, insulated connectors that had to be physically unbolted. Her fingers, accustomed to the delicate work of restoring ancient data scrolls, were clumsy and slow on the heavy, grease-caked bolts. But the adrenaline coursing through her veins gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. Outside the vault, the sounds of the archive's final death throes were growing louder. The groan of tortured metal, the shriek of stone being torn apart, and the constant, overwhelming chiming of the silicate conversion were a symphony of planetary destruction. Every tremor that shook the floor was a reminder that their time was measured in seconds. "Almost there," Eris shouted, her voice raw as she put all her weight into turning the final locking lever. With a gut-wrenching screech of metal on metal, the last clamp sprang open. The God Screamer went dark, its crimson glow fading to a dull, angry red, its powerful hum replaced by a profound, unsettling silence. The silicate spire in the doorway froze, its growth halted completely, now just a beautiful, deadly sculpture of a failed attack. "Don't celebrate yet," Jax warned, his eyes fixed on the now silent spire. "We just pissed it off. It knows the food is gone, but it's not going to just let us walk out the door." He was right. Even without the power source to feed on, the crystal was a physical barrier, a dense, razor-sharp forest of amethyst that completely blocked their only exit. Jax slung his pistol and pulled a small, circular device from his belt, twisted the top, and a low, resonant hum filled the air, counter-frequency to the silicate's chime. "Sonic resonator," he explained, his voice tight. "Won't destroy it, but it'll find the harmonic fractures in the crystal structure, the weak points. Stand back." He tossed the device, pointed hard to the base of the sphere with a magnetic clank. He then took cover behind the dais, pulling Eris down with him. A moment later, a high-pitched, almost unbearable whine filled the air, and the silicate spire began to vibrate, a low, ominous hum that grew in intensity until the very air seemed to shimmer. Hairline cracks began to appear throughout the crystal structure, spreading like a spider web, and with a final, deafening crack, the entire spire imploded, collapsing into a mountain of glittering, crystalline dust and razor-sharp shards. A cloud of fine, iridescent particles billowed into the vault, and Jax immediately slapped the external seal on his helmet back into place. Breathe that, and your lungs will be a pair of pretty geodes in about 30 seconds. He coughed, his voice now tinny through his helmet's comms. We need to go. Now! The journey back to the surface was a nightmare ascent through a dying world. The upper levels of the archive were no longer a silent, solemn graveyard, but a chaotic, collapsing hellscape. Crystalline growths burst from the walls and floors in random, unpredictable patterns. The air was thick with the chiming dust, and the very structure of the building was groaning under the strain of the planet's transformation. Arsha. They dodged falling ceiling panels that shattered into glittering shrapnel on impact and leaped over chasms that opened in the floor, revealing the deeper, crystallizing strata of the planet below. Through it all, Jax moved with a brutal, efficient grace, his instincts honed by a lifetime of survival in the galaxy's forgotten corners. He didn't just see a path, he saw a series of calculated risks. A fluid equation of falling debris and collapsing floors that he navigated with a terrifying confidence. He half-dragged, half-carried Eris through the chaos, his grip like iron on her arm, his presence a solid, unyielding anchor in the maelstrom of destruction. They finally burst through the main entrance of the archive, back into the open, crystalline air of Xylos. And the sight that greeted them was one of sublime, apocalyptic beauty. The sun, now low on the horizon, was setting, and its dying light was being captured and refracted by the amethyst plains, the frozen statues, and the billions of motes of crystal dust in the air, turning the entire world into a kaleidoscope of brilliant, shifting colors. It was the most beautiful sunset Eris had ever seen, and it was the last sunset her world would ever have. But there was no time for mourning. The stray dog was still sitting in its crater, but it was no longer alone. 2 silicate spires, massive, towering things that dwarfed the one in the vault, were growing from the ground on either side of the ship, their crystalline arms slowly, inexorably reaching for the scarred hull, as if the planet itself was trying to reclaim the metal intruder. She's right. The old girl does get nervous, Jax muttered, breaking into a dead sprint, pulling Eris along with him. If those things touch the hull, they'll drain the ship's power core and turn her into a permanent lawn ornament. They scrambled up the crater's edge, their boots slipping on the loose. Shattered crystal, the ship's ramp now seeming impossibly far away. The spires were growing faster now, the air around them crackling with static energy as they drew closer to the ship's fusion core. They were 20 meters from the ramp when a third spire erupted from the ground directly in their path. A solid, glittering wall of razor-sharp amethyst. They were cut off, without breaking stride. Jax shoved Eris behind him. "Get ready to run!" he yelled. And then he did something that defied all logic and reason. He charged directly at the crystalline wall. At the last possible second, he activated the magnetic clamps onto his boots, and with a surge of raw, desperate power, he ran straight up the vertical, crystalline surface. He was a small, dark figure against the glittering, impossible geometry of the spire. A fleeting moment of defiance against a planetary force. He reached the apex, 20 feet up, and then he leaped. For a moment, he was silhouetted against the dying sun, a human figure suspended between a dying world and a battered, ugly ship that was his only hope of escape. He landed with a bone-jarring crunch on the ship's ramp, rolling to dissipate the impact, and came up with his pistol already in hand, firing back at the spire he had just climbed. The bullets did little damage, but that wasn't the point. "Come on," he screamed, his voice a raw beacon in the encroaching, crystalline silence. The floor is lava, spurred on by a surge of adrenaline and a newfound, desperate faith in the madman who had come to rob her world. Eris ran. She didn't look for a path. She didn't think about the impossible odds. She just ran, her eyes fixed on the open ramp and the human figure silhouetted in its light. She scrambled over the base of the spire, her hands cut and bleeding from the sharp edges, and sprinted across the last few meters of open ground as Jax laid down a field of covering fire. She threw herself up the ramp just as the two larger spires finally made contact with the ship's hull. The lights on the stray dog flickered violently, and a deep, groaning sound came from the ship's engines as the silicates began to drain its power. "Ramp up!" Jax yelled, slapping a control panel on the wall. With a hydraulic hiss, the ramp began to rise, sealing them inside the dim, cramped confines of the cargo bay. The ship shuddered violently, the sound of crystal scraping against metal, a hellish screech that vibrated through the floor plates. "Strap in, archivist!" Jax shouted, already climbing the ladder to the cockpit. "This takeoff is going to be a little bumpy." Eris found a webbed crash couch and buckled herself in just as the ship's engines roared to life. Not with the clean, efficient hum of a Concordiate vessel, but with the guttural, angry roar of a caged beast being poked with a stick. The stray dog bucked and groaned, its landing struts screaming in protest as Jax forced the engines to full power, fighting against the parasitic drain of the silicates and the very gravity of the planet that was trying to hold them. Through the small, grimy porthole in the cargo bay door, Eris watched as her world, her beautiful, dying, crystalline world, fell away below them, a glittering jewel of a tomb in the endless, silent darkness of space. She was alive. She was a survivor. But as the last archivist of a dead world, she was also a ghost, haunted by the memories of everything she had lost, and shackled to a cynical, dangerous human who was her only connection to a future she couldn't possibly imagine. The silence of space was a lie. Eris learned this in the hours following their escape, a period that stretched into an eternity in the cramped, shuddering confines of the stray dog. The ship was dying, and its death was a cacophony of groans, hisses, and the high-pitched shriek of stressed metal. The lights, powered by a sputtering auxiliary generator, flickered in a frantic, syncopated rhythm, casting long, dancing shadows that turned the cluttered cargo bay into a landscape of twitching monsters. The inertial dampeners, damaged during their violent takeoff, had all but failed, and every minor course correction sent a bone-jarring shudder through the hull. Eris was strapped into her crash couch, the webbing cutting into her shoulders, but the physical discomfort was a distant, irrelevant hum beneath the crushing weight of her grief. She had watched her world die through a grimy porthole, and now she was adrift in its wake, a ghost haunting a junk pile, piloted by a thief. Jack stumbled down the ladder from the cockpit, one hand clamped to his side, his face pale beneath the grime and dried blood. The gash on his cheek from the crystal shard was a raw, angry line, but it was the dark stain spreading across the patched fabric of his undersuit that told Eris the real story. He had been injured more severely than he had let on. He collapsed into the co-pilot's chair, which was little more than a scavenged racing seat bolted to the floor, and began jabbing at a smoking console with his good hand. "Life support is stable," he grunted, his voice strained. "But the primary power conduits are fused. We're running on fumes and a prayer, and the ship's computer is singing a very sad song about imminent structural failure." He coughed, a wet, ragged sound, and a fresh bloom of red appeared on his lips. The silicates did a real number on the port engine nacelle. It's venting. Slowly. Eris unstrapped herself, her movements stiff and clumsy in the intermittent gravity. She found the ship's medkit, a rusty metal box filled with military surplus bandages, expired Bacta patches, and a terrifyingly large auto-suture, and knelt beside him. "You're bleeding internally," she said, her voice flat, the detached tone of an archivist cataloging an injury rather than a concerned crewmate. Jax flinched as she pressed a diagnostic scanner, another piece of battered, mismatched tech, against his side. "It's a scratch," he wheezed. "I've had worse." "The scanner disagrees," she countered, her voice gaining a sliver of its old authority. "You have a punctured lung and at least 2 cracked ribs. The silicate tendrils that scraped the hull must have sent a shock wave through the plating. You need a medical facility." Jax let out that familiar, grating laugh, which turned into a grimace of pain. "The only medical facility that'll treat a guy like me without asking for a Concordiate ID is a back-alley cyberdock with a blowtorch and a bottle of cheap whiskey. No, thank you. I'll take my chances with the expired patch." He snatched a Bacta patch from the kit and slapped it onto his side with a hiss of pain, the cheap sealant barely adhering to the blood-soaked fabric. "Besides," he continued, his breathing already a little less ragged as the crude stimulants in the patch went to work, "we have bigger problems. We can't outrun a Concordiate patrol, and we can't limp our way to any civilized system. We've got one option: port anarchy." The name was as ugly as it sounded. Eris had read about it in restricted files, a hollowed-out asteroid in the unclaimed territories that served as the Outer Rim's unofficial capital of smuggling, piracy, and every other vice the Concordiate pretended didn't exist. "We can't go there," she said. "A new kind of fear, a more personal, human fear, replacing the existential dread of the silicates. It's a haven for criminals." "Exactly," Jax said, a ghost of his cynical smirk returning. "Which means it's the one place in the galaxy where no one asks questions as long as your credit chit is good. It's also home to the best black market mechanic this side of the core worlds, a guy named Grizz. He can fix anything, for a price. And we need him, badly." He gestured to the dead, silent God Screamer, which was now lashed to the floor of the cargo bay with a web of magnetic clamps, its dark, ominous presence seeming to absorb what little light there was. "That thing is our ticket. It's also a death sentence if the wrong people find out we have it. We get to port anarchy. We lay low. I get Grizz to fix the dog. And I find a buyer discreet enough not to ask how we got it, and rich enough to make us forget. Then you and I part ways." And the plan was simple, brutal, and utterly terrifying. But as she looked at the flickering lights and listened to the ship's groaning protests, she knew he was right. They were out of options. Port Anarchy was not a place of quiet orbits and elegant docking procedures. It was a chaotic, anarchic ballet of battered freighters, sleek pirate cutters, and repurposed mining rigs, all vying for a spot on the asteroid's pockmarked surface. The station itself was a chaotic sprawl of interconnected domes, jury-rigged tunnels, and open-air platforms, all glowing with the garish, flickering light of 1,000 neon signs advertising everything from cheap synthetic liquor to untraceable weapons and bespoke genetic modifications. The air in the docking bay, when the ramp finally lowered, was a thick, humid cocktail of ozone, spilled fuel, and the smell of 1,000 different species living in close, unsanitary proximity. For Eris, who had spent her life in the sterile, climate-controlled halls of the archive, it was a sensory assault. For Jax, it was home. He navigated the crowded, bustling corridors with the easy confidence of a native, his hand never straying far from his pistol, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. He led Eris to a grimy, oil-stained workshop tucked away in the station's industrial sector, the sound of plasma torches and hydraulic lifts echoing off the greasy walls. A massive, four-armed alien with skin like tanned leather and a pair of cybernetic eyes that whirred as they focused, looked up from the engine block he was wrestling with. Jax, the mechanic, Grizz, rumbled, his voice like rocks grinding together. Still flying that rust bucket. I see. I thought it would have disintegrated by now. She's stubborn. Grizz, like her owner. Jax replied, leaning against the workbench. I need a new plasma injector manifold for a Mark IV fusion core, and I need it yesterday. Grizz's cybernetic eyes zoomed in on the damage to Jax's armor, then flicked to Eris, who was trying to make herself as small as possible in the doorway. Looks like you found more than just salvage this time, the mechanic rumbled. You've got the scent of real trouble on you. The expensive kind. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag. The kind of trouble that Kaelin Var likes to follow. The name meant nothing to Eris, but she saw the color drain from Jax's face. His casual confidence evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard tension. Var's here, he asked, his voice low. Docked her flagship, the Obsidian Hand, 2 cycles ago, Grizz confirmed. She's been sniffing around, asking questions about old tech, pre-collapse artifacts. Put a bounty on any information regarding unusual energy signals in the outer arm. Grizz's whirring eyes settled on Eris. Signals like the one that brought you here, I'd bet. The trap had been sprung before they had even known they were in it. The God Screamer's cry had not just woken Jax from his cynical slumber, it had alerted predators far more dangerous and infinitely more patient. Before Jax could respond, the shadows in the doorway darkened, and 2 figures stepped into the workshop. They were not the grimy, battle-scarred thugs that Eris had expected to find on Port Anarchy. They were tall, impeccably dressed in sleek, black armor that bore the sigil of a stylized, grasping hand, and they moved with the silent, deadly efficiency of corporate security. Between them stood a woman whose presence seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. She was human, her silver hair pulled back in a severe, elegant knot. Her face a mask of cold, aristocratic beauty. Her suit was not armor, but a tailored, high-collared garment of dark gray material that shimmered like polished steel. This was Kaelin Var. Jackson, she said, her voice calm, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion, like a surgeon discussing an incision. It's been a long time. I see you're still collecting other people's property. Jax's hand went to his pistol, but the 2 guards' sidearms were already drawn, their movements a fluid, practiced blur. Var, he bit out, his body tense as a coiled spring. I'm retired, just trying to make an honest living. Var's lips curved into a smile that held no humor, only the predatory satisfaction of a collector who had just cornered a rare, beautiful specimen. There is nothing honest about you, Jackson, but there is something profitable. Her cold, analytical gaze shifted to Eris, dismissing her as one might a piece of furniture, before settling on the cargo bay of Jax's battered psyche. That signal you answered, the one my long-range sensors picked up just before the Xylo system went dark. It was an artifact of immense power and historical significance. An artifact that belongs in my collection. She took a step forward, her confidence absolute. Give it to me, Jackson. And I will let you keep your ship, your life, and this librarian. It was the casual dismissal, the reduction of her entire existence to a mere footnote in a transaction that finally broke through Eris's fear. The old Eris, the scholar, the victim, would have cowered, but this Eris, the survivor of a dead world, the woman who had helped steal a god's voice from its tomb, found a new, cold fire igniting in her belly. That sigil, she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tense standoff. Everyone turned to look at her, surprised that the librarian had spoken. She pointed a trembling but steady finger at the emblem on the guard's armor. The obsidian hand. It was the corporate emblem of the Ethelred conglomerate, a pre-collapse weapons manufacturer. They specialized in bioresonance technology, attempting to weaponize the life force of entire planets. Their research was deemed a galactic atrocity, and their charter was revoked after their experiments led to the sterilization of the Kepler-186 system. Their files were sealed, their name erased from all official Concordiate records. Eris's voice was no longer the tremor of a victim, but the cold, sharp tone of a scholar presenting an irrefutable fact. She looked directly at Kaelin Var, whose perfect, cold smile finally faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise. "You're not just a collector," Eris said, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying certainty. "You're a descendant. You're not trying to preserve history. You're trying to reclaim your family's legacy. You want the God Screamer not for a museum, but to finish what your ancestors started." For a moment, the workshop was silent. The only sound the hum of Grizz's plasma torch. Kaelin Var's cold eyes narrowed, her surprise hardening into a look of pure, murderous fury. She had been exposed, her carefully crafted persona as a detached collector shattered by the last, forgotten voice of a dead library. Jax used that moment of stunned silence. "Grizz," he yelled, and a split second later, the massive mechanic slammed his fist onto a large, red button on his workbench. A deafening klaxon blared through the workshop, and a series of heavy, reinforced blast doors slammed down, sealing the workshop off from the main corridor. Kaelin Var and her guards were trapped inside with them. "You were always a reckless fool, Jackson," Var hissed, her composure returning as she drew a small, elegant energy pistol from within her jacket, its design as sleek and deadly as she was. "You've just turned a simple acquisition into a very messy and very final negotiation." Jax grinned, a true feral grin this time, full of desperation and defiance. He leveled his own battered, ugly pistol, its raw kinetic power a perfect answer to her elegant energy weapon. "Negotiations were never my strong suit," he said. "Welcome to the junkyard." The junkyard erupted. There was no negotiation, no final threat, just the instantaneous transition from a tense standoff to a maelstrom of calculated violence. Var's energy pistol discharged with a sharp, clean hiss, a bolt of crimson energy that superheated the air where Jax's head had been a split second before. He was already moving, diving behind a hulking, half-disassembled engine block, his own pistol roaring in response. The kinetic slug, a brutal chunk of metal, didn't dissipate against the wall like Var's energy bolt. It punched a fist-sized hole through a reinforced bulkhead, a visceral testament to its crude, unstoppable power. The two guards moved with terrifying synergy, one laying down, suppressing fire on Jax's position, while the other advanced on Grizz, a vibro blade humming to life in his hand. But this was Grizz's workshop, his kingdom of scrap and steel. With a bellow of rage that shook the very foundations, the four-armed mechanic grabbed the engine block he'd been working on, a solid mass of metal that weighed more than the guard himself, and heaved it. The guard, trained for elegant, precise combat, had no answer for the sheer brute force physics of a half-ton of machinery hurtling towards him. He was crushed against the workshop wall with a sickening crunch of armor and bone, his vibroblade clattering uselessly to the floor. Var's perfect composure finally cracked, her eyes widening in fury at the loss of her asset. She fired again, this time at Grizz, but the mechanic had already lumbered behind the massive hydraulic press that dominated the center of the room. The energy bolt glanced off its armored piston with a shower of sparks. This left the second guard, who now had a clear line of sight to Jax. He advanced, his pistol spitting a relentless stream of fire, forcing Jax to stay pinned down. Eris, huddled behind a stack of salvaged power converters, felt a familiar and paralyzing terror grip her. She was not a fighter. She was a scholar, a relic, a piece of luggage in this violent transaction. But then she saw Jax, wincing in pain as he reloaded, his patched-up side bleeding freely again. She saw the cold, methodical advance of the guard, and the ghost of Xylos, of her frozen friends and her silent, dying world, rose up in her, not as a memory of fear, but as a wellspring of cold, unadulterated rage. Her eyes darted around the workshop, not seeing weapons, but seeing systems, seeing tools. Her gaze fell upon the control panel for the overhead magnetic crane, its massive claw dangling 30 feet above the guard. The console was old, its interface a complex schematic of pressure gauges and power relays she couldn't possibly understand. But next to it was a simple override lever, painted a faded, urgent red, with a single word stenciled above it: emergency purge. Without a second thought, she scrambled to the console. The guard, distracted by his assault on Jax, didn't even notice her. Her hands shook as she wrapped them around the heavy lever. It was now or never. With a scream born of grief and fury, she threw her entire body weight into it. The lever groaned, then slammed down. The crane didn't lower. It purged. With a deafening clang of electromagnets disengaging, the half-ton cargo container it had been holding dropped. The guard looked up, his face a perfect mask of surprise for the fraction of a second before the container flattened him into the grimy floor. The workshop fell silent, the air thick with the smell of ozone and death. It was now just the three of them: Jax, wounded but defiant, Kaelin Var, her aristocratic mask now a snarl of pure hatred, and Eris, the librarian who had just killed a man with a piece of industrial equipment. "You see, Var," Jax coughed, staggering to his feet and using the engine block for support. "This is what happens when you corner things that have nothing left to lose. They get creative." Var raised her pistol, its barrel glowing with stored energy. "I underestimated the collateral," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "A mistake I will not make again." But Eris saw something Jax couldn't. Var wasn't just angry. She was exposed. Her power came from control, from intimidation, from the clean, sterile application of wealth and force. The raw, messy, unpredictable chaos of the junkyard had thrown her off her rhythm. "It's not over," Eris said, her voice steady now, amplified by a newfound, terrifying clarity. She walked slowly, deliberately, towards the stray dog, its ramp still open, the dark, silent shape of the God Screamer visible within. You wanted your family's legacy. You wanted a weapon that could silence world ice, but you don't understand it. You see it as a tool, but I've been inside its vault. I've felt its silence. It's not just a weapon, it's a memory. It remembers everything your ancestors did. Jax's eyes widened as he understood what she was planning. Eris. No, we don't know what it will do. Var hesitated, her curiosity momentarily overriding her rage. What is the librarian babbling about? Eris ignored them both, her hands flying across the control panel on the side of the God Screamer, a panel Jax had never even noticed. She wasn't a technician, but she was the last living being to have studied the Signan language, the last person who could read the faint, etched warnings on the device's casing. She wasn't trying for a full activation. She was trying to do what Jax had done to the vault door, to give it a jolt, a kick, to wake not its voice, but its echo. She found a diagnostic port and, with a grim certainty, then jammed a live power cable from Grizz's workbench into it. The God Screamer did not roar. It did not hum. It released a wave of absolute psychic silence, a pulse of pure negative sound that washed through the workshop. It was not the absence of noise, but the presence of an immense, ancient sorrow. For Jax and Grizz, it was a moment of profound, dizzying vertigo, a feeling of falling into a bottomless, silent sea. But for Kaelin Var, whose very DNA was tied to the atrocities the device was built to combat, it was something else entirely. Her eyes went wide, not with fear, but with a horrifying, empathetic agony. The scream she let out was not her own. It was a chorus, a symphony of a billion stolen voices, the psychic death rattle of the entire Kepler 186 system, the silent, crystalline agony of Xylos, all pouring into her consciousness at once. She dropped her pistol, her hands flying to her temples, her perfect, controlled facade shattering into a million pieces. She was no longer a collector or a conqueror. She was a living archive of all the pain her family had ever wrought, a ghost haunted by the victims she had never met. She collapsed to the floor, catatonic, her silent screams echoing in a place no one else could hear. "Get the ramp up," Jax gasped, clutching his side. "Grizz, get us out of here." The big mechanic, shaking his head to clear the psychic residue, slammed the blast doors open and scrambled into the stray dog's engine room. Eris, her legs trembling, followed Jax up the ramp. The ship shuddered to life, Grizz's patch job holding just long enough. With a roar of defiance, the stray dog lifted off, leaving the chaos of the workshop and the broken woman on its floor behind. They cleared the asteroid's chaotic airspace, punching a hole into the clean, quiet dark of deep space. Hours later, the ship was limping, but it was stable. Eris had properly dressed Jax's wounds, her hands now steady and sure. They sat in the dim light of the cockpit, the star-dusted void stretching out before them, the silent, shrouded God Screamer, an unspoken presence behind them. Her flagship still in orbit, Eris said, watching the scanner. But it's not moving. It's like it's waiting for an order that will never come. Jax nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the endless night. "So, what now? Archivist, we can't sell that thing. We can't use it. We can't even stay in civilized space. We're fugitives with the galaxy's most dangerous ghost in our cargo hold." Eris looked down at her hands, still stained with the grease and grit of the workshop. They were not the hands of a scholar anymore. They were the hands of a survivor. She thought of her library, of all the stories she had protected, of the warnings that had gone unheeded. When I worked in the archive, she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet, unbreakable resolve. My job was to preserve the past, to keep it safe, silent, and forgotten. Yea, and she looked up, meeting Jax's tired, questioning gaze. And for the first time, she smiled. It was not a happy smile, but it was a real one, forged in fire and loss. I was wrong, she said. Some stories aren't meant to be filed away. They're meant to be a warning. We're not scavengers anymore. Jax. He raised a skeptical eyebrow. No. Then what are we? We're librarians, Eris said, a fierce, new light in her eyes. And we have a story to tell. A story the entire galaxy needs to hear. The Stray Dog. A battered, ugly ship crewed by a broken scavenger and a haunted archivist turned its nose towards the unknown, carrying not a treasure to be sold, but a burden to be borne. A silent scream that they would make sure the universe would never again have the luxury of ignoring.